In this video, I'm going to solve a problem using arrays. And what this problem is going to ask us to do is create a program that will let the user input rainfall amounts for each month. And when they have done that, we're going to calculate the average rainfall for that entire year. And then we're going to go through and we're going to list for each month what the total rainfall was and how much that varies from that average. So we're going to use arrays to solve this. We're going to store all the rainfall amounts in an array. This is really asking us to do two different things, or two separate little problems to solve here. The first is getting input from the user and storing that data into an array. And the second part then is going to be processing the data, and as part of that process, output the results. And so the reason I'm talking about them separately is because we are going to solve them separately, or I'm going to solve them separately. And I'm going to start by ignoring the input part of this problem because, well, partly because we have to start somewhere, right? We have to pick some place to jump in and get started. But also, if we ask the user for input and we're throwing those values into an array, until we are able to output it and show it on the screen, we don't know if it's working anyway. So we might as well just kind of get the program started by not asking the user for input and just declaring some arrays, some array data, and getting us going. So let's switch over here to NetBeans and get started on this. So I've already created my project here in NetBeans, and I've made two decisions just in the interest of staying focused here. This is going to be just a console application. I'm not going to use any GUI stuff for this, and I'm also not going to make what I would consider an object-oriented design, even though I'm more of an object-oriented person myself. I'm just going to use static methods here so that we can focus on the array information, and it would work. It would look similar if we put it in classes and objects, but we won't spend time on that for this. So, all right. So I'm going to start out by creating my array to store this data, and rainfall is often reported with fractions of inches, right? So a month may have 1.7 inches of rainfall. So we're going to need to use doubles for this. And it will be an array. I'm going to call it just rainfall. Now, the way that I ultimately will declare this is going to be probably that line of code right there, because it's going to need to hold 12 months worth of data. So the length or the size of the array is going to be 12. I had mentioned that we're not going to deal with input until the end, and so instead what we're going to do, I'll comment that out so I have it for later, and I'm going to use just an initializer list to create some data to work with here from the beginning. And I'm just kind of making this up as I go, so this is not actual data or anything like that, but let's see, I'm sure my clever pattern here as I go through. And again, this is just so that we have some data to work with as we go through this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 10, 11. Oops, I shorted it by 1. And we can get everything working, verify that it works with this set of data. And if everything looks good, then we can go back and add in the user input and do all of our final testing on that kind of data. So that's what we're going to use for our data to get us started. And the first thing we'll want to work on is just outputting that data so that we can see what's in the array, and if we make any changes to the array, and ultimately when the users are adding input, we'll be able to verify that everything looks the way we want it to look. So we're going to create a method for that. I'll call it public static void. I'm just going to call it display rainfall. And what I'm going to do, notice that I made this array a local variable because I wanted to point out that you can pass arrays around just like any other variables. And so this is going to be a double array. I'll just call it data here. I don't want to use the exact same name just to avoid confusion. And so this void method is just going to look at this array of doubles that are passed in and go through it and output it to the console for the user to see. And one of the things to take note of here is that we haven't specified a size, because this program, I want it to be flexible, or the term you hear in computer programming is extensible, meaning that I want to be able to make changes to the program and have it still work. If I put in 12 months, I want it to work just fine. If I put in 5 years worth of data, I still want it to work without having to go back and change the code. So there's nothing in this that specifies what the size is. It's going to look at this array that's passed in, and however big it is, that's how much data it's going to deal with. So this is a simple traversal. And our traversal, this is just your kind of your most generic of traversal loops here. I'm going to start at 0. Remember the little tricky thing that beginning programmers sometimes struggle with, that the numbering for indexes in an array starts at 0. And we're not used to that. In our daily lives, we start numbering at 1. So January is month number 1, and then February is 2, and that means that December is month number 12. But if we start numbering at 0, like Java does, then January is not month number 12, it's month number 11. So we have to make sure that we end our traversal at the correct spot. So I'm going to say data dot length. And notice that I used a less than sign, not less than equal to. So that's what keeps me from going out of bounds, is the term we use. And what some programmers will do to make that absolutely clear is something like that. We'll say as long as I is less than or equal to data.length minus 1. It's the same exact line of code, right? Or chunk of code. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. This, I think, tends to be the more common usage, so I'll go with that. And so this little for loop is really important. You're going to use it often when you work with arrays, because that's what you have to do with arrays, is go through them and do something with the data inside. And what we want to do is just system.out.println, and my first kind of iteration at this, I'm just going to do the most basic of output, and I will just do that. And before I run it, I need to call the array. I wish I could say that I had omitted that on purpose, and it would have been instructive, because this is a common mistake for new programmers, but I just wasn't paying attention. So we do need to call the array, or the method there, and pass in the array. So let's run that and see what we get. All right, and that is what I expect. I can verify that data against my little initializer list up there, and since I used a pattern, it's pretty easy to see that it's working the way we intended. So that is kind of the most basic way of doing this. Now the problem states that we need to output the name of the month, and also the total, and then some other data as we get farther into it. So I'm going to need to have a way of stating which month it is that goes with the data. So I'm going to create another method for that. I'm going to create a static method that's going to return a string called month name. And what it's going to take is an integer that I'll call month number. And the idea is it's going to look at the month number, and it's going to return the name that goes along with that month. And so then we'll be able to use it in our print line statement here to identify the month by name rather than number. And now one of the things that we have to remember, and I have to remember, because it's a natural mistake to make, is that this number is going to be 0 based, and so 0 is going to be January, not 1. So there are going to be a couple different ways we can do this, and this will be one of those places where some people will prefer like a switch selection kind of thing, and that's certainly a good idea, but I will just use some if statements here, and I'm going to short circuit them by returning right away. So if I'm going to say if month num is equal to 0, then I'm going to return January, and I'm going to pause the video now, copy and paste that, and set that for all the other months. Okay, and so I just cut and paste that, and then made the changes for each month. And there are going to be two concerns here that I need to address with this. One I'm going to address immediately. If we have all of our return statements inside or within if statements, then we're going to have this compiler problem where it's going to say, well, not all code paths return a value, for example, because it is possible that somebody will pass in the value 13, and then none of these if statements will trigger, and there's no return value. So the compiler doesn't like this. I need to have kind of a fallback at the very end, and I'm going to give it just intentionally bad data, so that if I'm ever running my program and it refers to some month as unknown, then I know that there's some kind of a problem. And in fact, maybe I could even make it very clear to the user when that's running. So that's one problem. The other problem I'm not going to address immediately, but at the very end of the video, I'm going to throw up some code that will show you one way of solving it. And that is, well, what if we intentionally want to go beyond month number 11? What if, like I said earlier, we want to have, say, 5 years worth of data, and what happens when we get to 12? It needs to go back to January and start again. And so we should, if our program is going to be extensible like that, we need to address that. So I'll come back to that later. You can maybe be thinking about that in the back of your mind as we go. All right, so this method I think now looks good. And we can try using this method here. So back in my display rainfall, I'm going to say rainfall total for the month of, and we'll say month name I, right? Let's see how that looks. Okay. It looks like it's working correctly. That's another thing we'll need to keep an eye on as we test this, and make sure that those month names are being reported correctly. So it looks like we're doing pretty good so far on our display rainfall. There is going to be one other part, and I'm going to throw it in here, even though I'm not ready to finish it yet. Remember, the problem says that and along with the total rainfall, we need to report the variance between that rainfall amount and the average or the mean. So even though we don't have that data yet, I'm going to put systemout.println, and we'll say variance from mean, and I can tab that in a little bit to indent it, and we'll have to finish that line of code when we have the data that we need to do that. So I always like to run it, make sure that I know what it's doing now. Okay, so for each month, it's going to report the total rainfall, and then it's going to have the variance from the mean. So at this point, we've completed kind of one chunk of the problem, so to speak. So if we kind of reset our approach here, we still haven't gotten user input, and we're not going to quite yet, because we need to calculate and display the average rainfall for the year. And so that's going to be the next thing, because we can't get a variance until we have that. And of course, the problem tells us we need to display that. So that's what we're going to look at next, is how do we get the average rainfall from that data in the array. So we are going to create another method for this, and I'll put it right up here so that I keep it close to the main where we can see it all. And this is going to be essentially a method that calculates the average of the numbers in the array and then returns it. So it's going to return a double, and we'll call it, I'll call it monthly average. Actually, I'll call it average rainfall, and we'll call our variable monthly average. Not that it matters, but that's the kind of the naming I'll use. And again, it's going to need access to that array data, so we'll pass that in as a parameter. And this time I won't forget to call that. So I'm going to create a double up here called monthly average, and I'll initialize it to 0 just out of habit more than anything, because on the very next line I'm going to say monthly average equals average rainfall, it says down there, so we better change that. It's an interesting typo. Even spelled correctly if rainfall is actually a word. There we go, average rainfall, and we're going to pass in the rainfall data, and then we're going to output that. So I'm just going to say system.out.put print line average monthly rainfall. Sorry for talking as I type here, kind of a habit. Okay, and I'm getting this compiler error because this is supposed to return a double and it doesn't return anything. So sort of like what I did with that other method with our fallback, I like to return sort of obviously bad data. In this case, I haven't actually written the average algorithm yet, so for now it's going to return -1, so that if that appears anywhere in my program, I know that there is some kind of a problem or something that's incomplete, like in this case says average monthly rainfall is -1. Obviously that's not really the case. So okay, so we've got the user interface part of it. Now we can talk about the algorithm itself. This is again going to be a traversal. We're going to go through and look at each value in the array, and we're going to use it for a calculation. Now the calculation for the formula for calculating a mean is to sum all of the numbers and then divide that sum by the quantity of numbers. So in other words, we're going to add up all of the numbers inside of our array, and we're going to divide it by 12 or however many numbers there happen to be. So so I'm going to need two variables here for this. I'm going to need a double that I will call sum, and again I'll initialize that to 0 to start with, and then I'm going to need a double that I'll just call it avg, and I'll initialize that to 0, and I'll change that to avg there. And now we're going to need our little traversal, and so again I'm just going to steal my my for loop code from down here. Because it's always the same, right? If we need to go through an array, no matter how long that array is, this is the code that does it, and all we have to change is the identifier for the array in question. So what I need to do at this point, or at each step along the way, at each iteration of this loop, is I want to take whatever value is in that element, and I want to add it to sum. And so this is just going to be sum plus equals data I, data index I. So that says, give me what's in the I index of data and add that on to sum. And so when this for loop completes over however many pieces of data there are, sum is going to be the total of everything in the array. And we will verify that temporarily here with just a little system.out statement. And that is temporary. We're going to take that out because it doesn't ever ask us to, the problem doesn't ask us to report the total, but the sum is 19.8. I have no idea if that's accurate or not because I haven't actually added those up, but it seems reasonable enough for the time being, and we'll talk about testing this again in just a moment. But so for now, I'll comment that out, and we may want it later. But that seems to be at least in the ballpark. There's nothing way out of line with that data. So let's assume for a moment that that's correct, that algorithm is working the way we intend. And the last bit of this formula then is to say, okay, we're going to take the sum and we are going to divide it by the number of elements in the array. And so we're going to say average equals sum divided by, and we're going to get back to that idea of extensibility again, because we know that this program calls for us to have 12 months. But I had said that one of my programming practices is to try and make this code extensible, so that if they want to work with more or less than 12, our code will still work. And in fact, that is what we're going to do when we start testing user input. So I don't want to hard code the literal 12 in there. I'm going to refer whenever possible to the length variable. Okay, and so let's see how we're doing with that so far. Now the way I set up the pattern of my data is since I just sort of added a tenth each time, my average should be something that's similar to these numbers right in the middle. So I don't know mathematically if that's correct. We have that double rounding issue there. I don't know if mathematically that is the correct calculation, but it certainly looks like it is accurate. So again, for the moment, we're going to assume that that is correct. Okay, and so if it is, then our average rainfall method seems to be done. Okay, so we have some leftover business, some unfinished business in our display method here. We said that we need to display the variance from the mean, and we couldn't do that because we didn't know what the average was. Well, now we have a way to calculate that. So within this display rainfall, we need to display the difference between the rainfall for this month and the average so that we can see how it compares. So for that to work, the display rainfall method needs access to that average. And we have a couple different ways we can get that. And one of them is we could just call that method again. We could say double average equals, what did I call I already forgot my name, average rainfall or average rainfall. I think I had it before, average rainfall, and pass in data. And now we have it as a double, and we can as a local variable, and we can work with it from there. And that's fine. If you were to do that on an assignment, that is a perfectly acceptable way of getting that data. On some level, it does duplicate some work, some processing power, so to speak, because we've already calculated the average up in the main method. We've already run this algorithm that traverses the array and gets that average for us. And what we're telling it to do by calling that method again is saying run it again. Modern processors have plenty of horsepower for the kind of projects that we write in this class, but I think it's not a bad idea to put in your head at least that that might not always be the case. What if we were analyzing monthly rainfall for millions of locations around the world over decades of time? We don't want to have to calculate that average that is potentially time consuming any more than we have to. So this solution is fine, but what I want to do is show another way we can get that data without actually running the algorithm again. And that is, we'll just ask for it as a parameter. We'll say that in order to call this method, you're going to need to give me an array, and you're going to need to give me an average. And so what happens when I change that method header is I break my code up here because I called display rainfall, and I need to now pass in that monthly average. Again, not a big deal, but either way is fine with me as far as a solution. So there we go. We don't need a local variable now because we have that parameter, which is essentially a local variable. And what we're going to do here is we're going to display the difference between the average and the rainfall for this month. And I'll confess that I'm not, I have no idea from a sort of a statistician's point of view if variance should be the average minus this month's total, or if it should be this month's total minus the average. The problem doesn't state it. I think this is the way that's going to kind of make sense to me. We'll try it and see how it looks, I guess. But, and oops, I forgot my concatenation there. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and so here's the way this data is working, this variance is working, is if the average is 1.65 and January is 1.1, it's returning 0.55, and I think I like it the other way. I think I want it to say negative 0.55 if we're under, so I think I will switch those. And this is probably the kind of thing that I should have looked up before I started recording, I guess. I don't really know if one way is considered the correct way or not. And now I've messed up my parentheses there. Okay, let me see if I have a feeling I'm going to like that better. So that if we're under the average, it's showing a negative number. I do think that's probably better. And then months where it's above the average, it shows a positive number. So I think I like that. And unless the problem states, then I guess you're safe kind of making your own assumption. 30 seconds on Google probably solves that for us as well. So I think we're done with the part of the problem that asks us to process and output the array. Let's just kind of refocus by looking at the problem again. Calculate and display the average rainfall of the year. I believe we got that done. Display the month name along with the rainfall amount and its variance from the mean. So I believe that we're good to go on that part of the problem. All that's left now is to handle user input. So let's kind of refocus on the main method here. And remember, I started out by commenting out this line of code that declares the array in the way that we really are going to need it declared. I am going to make one change, mostly because with this video we want to save at least a little bit of time. I don't want to have you watch me type in 12 numbers every time we are going to test this. So I'm going to temporarily change it to 3 and just work with 3 dates at a time, 3 rainfall amounts at a time, I mean. And when I'm done, I'll switch it back to 12. And when you do something like that, it's fine when you're working, but you do need to make sure that you test it thoroughly in its final state before you turn it in, for example. So, okay, so I've got my array declared, and what needs to happen here is in this section of code, I need to get all of this input. I need to prompt the user for however many pieces of input we need and put those into the array. Util.scanner. And I'll need to make a scanner object that I can use to collect this input. So scanner, I'll call it n equal to scanner.in. This is a matter of style. I prefer to declare all my variables in one place at the top of my code block and then use them down below. There are programmers who just declare them as they go. Either one is fine. All right. And I guess while I'm at it, I will make a so the basic idea here is I'm going to prompt the user system.out.print, and I'll say enter the rainfall for January. And what we'll do then is we will say that rainfall 0 equals in dot next double. And I just want to test that and see how we're doing. Into the rainfall for January, and I'm going to put in like a really giant number here to make it kind of obvious when we output this. So remember that I modified my array so that it only has 3 elements, and January does indeed have that large number that I put in. February and March, because I didn't put any values in them, still retain their default values, which is 0.0. So it's not done, but it's working the way that I want it to work. And now here's where we have kind of an interesting choice to make, because I could have, of course, do something like this, and you're very quickly going to see the problem, which is that if I want to do this 12 times, it's a lot of copying and pasting. And remember this idea of extensibility. What if I want to have 5 years worth of data? So copying and pasting usually is a sign that maybe there's another way to look at this. Either we create a method or we use a loop. In this case, I think we'll try using a loop. And so the concept here is that I'm once again going to do an array traversal. This time, instead of doing a traversal where I read or process the data that's already there, I'm going to do a traversal where I get input from the user and put it into the array. So this is just that same code that we've been using for all of our traversals so far. And I'm going to make just a couple minor changes here. First of all, instead of saying for January, I'm going to say, I could use a format string, I guess, for that, but I'll just quickly do this. I'll say month name I. And then I'll change that to say I. And once again, the beauty of this type of a setup is that it's going to repeat as many times as is necessary to fill up my array at whatever size I've declared it. I declared mine to 3, so this should repeat 3 times. So let's see what we get. Rainfall for January. I'm going to put in 5, and then I'll put in 10, and then I'll put in 15. And my reasoning, in case it's not obvious, is this involves math that I can do very easily in my head without having test cases prepared ahead of time. So 5 plus 10 plus 15 is 30, divided by 3 is 10, so my average seems to be calculating correctly. For January, it was 5 inches of rainfall, which is -5 compared to the mean. February is 10, which is right at the mean, and March is 15, which is 5 above the mean. So again, it looks like that appears to be working the way that I want, and I have the advantage as the teacher here that my solution doesn't have to be graded, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek because it's always important to test your code. I'm not going to subject you to watching me do some kind of thorough testing, but the idea, as always, is come up with some data where you know what the results should be, and make sure you try some different edge cases and throw some stuff at it that maybe isn't exactly within what we would normally consider our parameters to be, just to see how your program behaves. So try giving it a negative number. Try giving it 5,000 inches of rain 1 month. Just try some different stuff to see what happens. I'm gonna, for this first simple test case here, I'm just going to give it just real straightforward numbers here. And again, part of what this does is I know that my average is going to be right in the middle there. 6.5 seems right, and I can compare how everything looks versus the mean. And again, it looks like this seems to be working. It would require just a little bit more testing to make sure that everything's really handling all the situations that we need correctly. Otherwise, I think we're about done. I just have one leftover bit of business, and it's really not required by the problem. It just goes back to that idea of extensibility. So it's this month name issue where we have said if it's equal to 0, it's January, all the way up through if it's equal to 11, the month is December. And what happens if I decide to allow the user to put in more data? What if I put in 25, for example? So we're going to have just over 2 years of data. And as we mentioned, we're going to start getting unknown for the month numbers. And I'm going to just stop there because we don't really need to worry about what happens from there. In fact, I can just put in some garbage data and crash it out. The teacher in me feels like that's something we should address, and I'm going to pause the video for a moment and give you a second to think about how we can solve that, because we have this problem where, sure, I could just copy and paste those and now say 12, 13, 14, but where does it end? How will we ever know how many months of data this program needs to be able to handle? Sometimes that's given to you. The client or your teacher or whomever says that you need to make sure it can handle 12 in this case. But sometimes we don't know, and it is nice when we can come up with a solution that will handle anything. So I'm going to pause the video here for a moment. So I've addressed this problem with one line of code, and I like this kind of solution. This seems really clever to me. I'm using the modulus operation, and I'm going to leave it to you to try this out and see what it does. Modulus is one of those things that we throw at you early on in programming when you're learning addition and subtraction and multiplication and just simple arithmetic. We say, oh, by the way, here's modulus, which will give you the remainder. And it's not always clear to beginners how that is useful. This is one example where something like modulus can be useful, and you can mess around with modulus if you don't remember how it works and kind of see what that does. But I'll let you try that solution and see what you think. There are, of course, other ways we could have addressed that as well. But at this point, I believe that the problem is complete, and I'm be ready to turn this in.